In the tranquil town of Meadowbrook, a place where nothing significant ever seemed to happen, the peace was shattered by an incident so horrific that it would later be featured in a true crime documentary titled Grisly Murder: A Husband's Dark Secret. The protagonist of this story is a woman named Emily Harris, a 48-year-old pediatric nurse known for her dedication and compassionate care. Emily was the heart of her community, her home often filled with the laughter of children and the aroma of freshly baked cookies. Her life seemed perfect on the outside, but a darkness lurked beneath the surface. Emily had been married to Dr. Jonathan Harris, a 55-year-old entomologist at Meadowbrook University, for over 2 decades. They were well regarded in their community, though some found Jonathan's reserved and distant demeanor unsettling. Emily and Jonathan had no biological children, but had fostered several over the years. Their latest ward, Chloe Benson, had just turned 18 and was preparing for college. Emily had grown exceptionally close to Chloe, treating her like her own daughter. But beneath this veneer of familial warmth, a dark secret festered. Chloe and Jonathan had developed feelings for each other, a relationship that Emily was unaware of until it was too late. As the summer of 2019 drew to a close, Emily began to notice subtle changes in Chloe's behavior and Jonathan's frequent absences. Her once peaceful home became a place of suspicion and quiet tension. On the night of July 29, 2019, Meadowbrook's tranquility was violently disrupted. The body of Emily Harris was found in the backyard of her home, partially hidden among the garden plants she so lovingly tended. The discovery was made by a neighbor, Lisa Turner, who had come over to return a baking dish she had borrowed earlier in the week. Lisa noticed the back gate was ajar, which was unusual. As she ventured into the backyard, she stumbled upon Emily's lifeless body. Emily had been brutally beaten with a crowbar and strangled with a rope. Blood spattered the garden path, and the crowbar lay discarded under a bush. Lisa's scream echoed through the quiet neighborhood, and she immediately called the police. The first responders on the scene described it as one of the most gruesome crimes Meadowbrook had ever seen. Detectives Michael Sanchez and Olivia Cooper were assigned to the case. Both were experienced investigators, known for their meticulous attention to detail. Upon arriving at the scene, they quickly cordoned off the area with yellow police tape, carefully examining every inch of the backyard. Dr. Susan Atkins, the forensic pathologist, noted the severe head trauma and the ligature marks on Emily's neck, confirming that she had been beaten and then strangled. The news of Emily's murder spread rapidly through Meadowbrook, shocking the close-knit community. People who had known Emily as a kind and caring nurse were left in disbelief. How could such a brutal act occur in their peaceful town? As the investigation began, suspicion naturally fell on those closest to Emily, starting with her husband, Jonathan. When the police arrived at Jonathan's lab to question him, he seemed calm and cooperative, claiming he had been at work all day and returned home late, finding the house empty. His colleagues corroborated his alibi, but the detectives found Jonathan's lack of emotion when discussing his wife's death unsettling. Despite this, there was no immediate evidence linking him to the crime. The investigation then turned to Chloe. The young woman had been living with the Harris family for the past year and had become a central figure in their lives. Chloe's academic brilliance and tragic past had endeared her to Emily, but the detectives sensed there was more to her story. Chloe's reserved demeanor during questioning raised further suspicions. She spoke fondly of Emily but seemed detached, her answers rehearsed, as if she had prepared for this moment. As Michael and Olivia delved deeper into Chloe's life, they uncovered a series of troubling details. Her relationship with Jonathan, which began shortly after her 18th birthday, and the growing tension between her and Emily in the weeks leading up to the murder. Chloe's alibi, that she had been studying alone at her apartment the night Emily was killed, did little to alleviate the detectives' doubts. With the evidence pointing towards the Harris family, the detectives knew they were on the brink of uncovering a dark and twisted tale of betrayal and murder. But they needed more concrete proof, something that would tie Jonathan and Chloe to the crime beyond a shadow of a doubt. As the investigation unfolded, the once quiet town of Meadowbrook became the center of a media frenzy. Reporters and true crime enthusiasts flocked to the town, eager to uncover the sordid details of the case. But for the residents, The focus was on one thing: justice for Emily Harris, a woman whose life had been violently cut short by the very people she trusted most. As the investigation into Emily Harris's murder deepened, detectives Michael Sanchez and Olivia Cooper found themselves entangled in a web of deceit and hidden motives. The quiet town of Meadowbrook, once known for its tranquility, was now the backdrop for a dark and twisted narrative that no one could have predicted. In the days following Emily's death, the police focused their attention on her husband, Jonathan, and their foster daughter, Chloe. The initial shock of Emily's brutal murder had barely settled when the community learned of an unexpected development. Just 6 days after Emily's death, Jonathan and Chloe had married in a small, private ceremony. The news sent shockwaves through Meadowbrook, raising more questions than answers. Why would Jonathan marry his foster daughter so soon after his wife's tragic death? And what role did Chloe play in Emily's murder? The detectives knew they had to dig deeper. Chloe's apartment became the focus of their next search. Inside, they found a hidden compartment in the garage, a small, secluded space that contained several of Chloe's personal items. Among them was a journal, its pages filled with entries that revealed a disturbing side of Chloe that no one had seen before. In her own words, she detailed her growing frustration with Emily, whom she referred to as a nuisance and an obstacle. One entry, dated just days before the murder, spoke of a plan to eliminate the problem and hinted at a deeper involvement in Emily's death. The journal was a breakthrough. It not only confirmed Chloe's animosity toward Emily, but also suggested that the murder had been premeditated. But the detectives needed more. They needed evidence that directly linked Jonathan to the crime, and they needed to understand the full extent of the plan that had led to Emily's death. Meanwhile, Chloe was brought in for further questioning. This time, the detectives presented her with the journal. Her demeanor shifted dramatically. Gone was the calm, composed young woman from the earlier interviews. Instead, Chloe became agitated, her hands trembling as she tried to explain away the incriminating entries. She insisted that the journal was merely a way for her to vent her frustrations and denied any involvement in the murder. But the detectives weren't convinced. They pressed Chloe on her relationship with Jonathan, asking her how long the affair had been going on and whether Emily had ever confronted her about it. Chloe hesitated before admitting that Emily had indeed grown suspicious in the weeks leading up to her death. There had been arguments, heated exchanges that left Emily in tears and Jonathan increasingly distant. Chloe's confession added another layer to the story. It was clear that the relationship between Jonathan and Chloe had not been a secret for long, and Emily's growing awareness of it had created a volatile situation in the Harris household. But had it been enough to drive Jonathan to murder? Or was Chloe the mastermind behind the plan, using her relationship with Jonathan to manipulate him into committing the crime? The detectives knew they needed to confront Jonathan again. This time they had more than just suspicions. They had Chloe's journal, her confession of the affair, and the evidence from the crime scene. They found Jonathan in his university lab, just as calm and collected as ever. But when they mentioned the journal, his composure faltered. Jonathan tried to downplay the significance of the entries, dismissing them as the ramblings of a troubled young woman. But the detectives could see through his facade. They pressed him on the timeline of events, asking him where he had been on the night of the murder, and why he had decided to marry Chloe so soon after Emily's death. Jonathan's responses were evasive, and the detectives knew they were getting closer to the truth. They decided to turn up the pressure. Olivia brought up the possibility that Chloe had acted on her own, that she had been the one to kill Emily, driven by jealousy and anger. But Jonathan's reaction surprised them. Instead of agreeing, he became defensive, insisting that Chloe was innocent and that she had nothing to do with the murder. It was a telling moment. The detectives realized that Jonathan's protective instincts toward Chloe were stronger than they had anticipated. He wasn't just trying to shield her from suspicion. He was trying to protect her from the consequences of a crime they had both been involved in. As the questioning continued, Jonathan's story began to unravel. The detectives picked apart his alibi, finding inconsistencies and gaps that he struggled to explain. He admitted that he had been with Chloe on the night of the murder, but claimed that they had been out of the house, away from the crime scene. Yet he couldn't provide any solid evidence to back up his claims. The detectives left the interview with more questions than answers, but they were certain of one thing. Jonathan and Chloe were both involved in Emily's death. They just needed to prove it. Over the next few days, the investigation intensified. The police brought in forensic experts to re-examine the evidence from the crime scene. They tested the crowbar for fingerprints, hoping to find something that would definitively link Jonathan to the weapon. They also analyzed the rope used to strangle Emily, searching for any traces of DNA that could connect either Jonathan or Chloe to the crime. As the results came in, the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. The crowbar bore traces of Chloe's fingerprints, but there were also partial prints that matched Jonathan's. The rope, too, held evidence. Tiny fibers that matched a shirt found in Chloe's apartment, further implicating her in the murder. With this new evidence in hand, the detectives were ready to make their move. They obtained arrest warrants for both Jonathan and Chloe, charging them with Emily's murder. The once quiet town of Meadowbrook watched in shock as the police arrested the couple, their secrets laid bare for the world to see. But the story was far from over. As Jonathan and Chloe were taken into custody, the detectives knew that the hardest part was still ahead, proving their guilt in court and uncovering the full truth behind Emily Harris's tragic death. The arrest of Jonathan and Chloe sent shockwaves through Meadowbrook. The once respected doctor and his young wife, now at the center of a grisly murder investigation, became the subjects of relentless media scrutiny. Journalists descended upon the town, eager to capture every sordid detail of the case that had shaken this peaceful community to its core. In the days following their arrest, Jonathan and Chloe were held in separate facilities, and the interrogation process intensified. Detectives Michael Sanchez and Olivia Cooper knew that they needed to extract confessions, or at least enough information to paint a clear picture of the events leading up to Emily's murder. Chloe was the first to crack. After hours of questioning, she finally broke down, tears streaming down her face as she recounted the twisted series of events that had led to Emily's death. But even in her confession, Chloe tried to minimize her role in the crime. She claimed that Jonathan had been the mastermind, that he had planned everything and coerced her into going along with it. "He said it was the only way," Chloe sobbed. "He told me we couldn't be together unless she was gone. I didn't want to do it. I swear I didn't. But he kept saying it was the only way out." According to Chloe, Jonathan had become increasingly paranoid in the weeks leading up to the murder. Emily's suspicions had grown, and Jonathan feared she would discover the affair and ruin both his career and his relationship with Chloe. He convinced Chloe that Emily had to be eliminated, presenting it as a necessary evil for their future together. But Chloe's confession wasn't entirely consistent. As the detectives pressed her for details, they noticed discrepancies in her story, small contradictions that hinted at a deeper level of involvement. Chloe tried to shift the blame onto Jonathan, painting herself as a reluctant accomplice, but the detectives weren't convinced. Meanwhile, Jonathan remained steadfast in his denials. He admitted to the affair, acknowledging that his relationship with Chloe had crossed the line, but he adamantly denied any involvement in Emily's murder. He portrayed Chloe as a troubled young woman who had become obsessed with him, claiming that she had acted alone out of jealousy and desperation. "I never wanted any of this," Jonathan insisted during one of the interrogations. "I loved Emily. I never would have hurt her. Chloe, she's unstable. She did this on her own, and now she's trying to drag me down with her." But the evidence against Jonathan continued to mount. Forensic analysis of the crime scene had already linked him to the murder weapon, and Chloe's journal entries further implicated him in the planning of the crime. The detectives knew they had to find the missing pieces of the puzzle, those final details that would prove beyond a doubt that Jonathan and Chloe had conspired to kill Emily. As the investigation progressed, the detectives uncovered new leads that painted a clearer picture of the relationship between Jonathan and Chloe. They spoke with Chloe's former teachers and classmates, who described her as intelligent but emotionally fragile. Many of them had noticed a change in her behavior after she began living with the Harris family. She became more withdrawn, more secretive. Some even mentioned seeing her with Jonathan outside of school hours, their interactions appearing more intimate than what would be expected between a foster father and daughter. The detectives also dug deeper into Jonathan's past, searching for any signs of instability or previous indiscretions. They discovered that Jonathan had a history of questionable relationships with younger women, including several incidents that had been quietly swept under the rug by the university administration. These revelations further solidified the detectives' belief that Jonathan was not the innocent victim he claimed to be. As the evidence piled up, the prosecution began preparing their case. The district attorney, Margaret Ellis, was known for her tenacity and sharp legal mind. She had handled high-profile cases before, but this one was different. This was a case that had captivated the entire country. Margaret knew that the stakes were high, and she was determined to ensure that justice would be served for Emily Harris. The trial date was set for November 15th, 2019, and as the day approached, tension in Meadowbrook reached a fever pitch. The courthouse was surrounded by news vans, reporters eager to catch a glimpse of the defendants as they were escorted inside. Inside, the courtroom was packed with spectators, including Emily's grieving family and friends, who had come to witness the trial that would determine the fates of Jonathan and Chloe. As the trial began, the prosecution laid out their case in painstaking detail. Margaret Ellis presented the evidence meticulously, starting with the discovery of Emily's body and the forensic findings that linked both Jonathan and Chloe to the crime. She introduced Chloe's journal as a key piece of evidence, reading aloud the chilling entries that detailed her growing resentment toward Emily and her twisted desire to eliminate the problem. Margaret also called on forensic experts who testified about the physical evidence found at the scene: the crowbar with both Chloe's and Jonathan's fingerprints, the rope fibers that matched Chloe's clothing, and the blood-stained gloves discovered in Chloe's apartment. The prosecution's case was strong, and Margaret's methodical approach left little room for doubt in the minds of the jurors. But the defense wasn't ready to concede. Jonathan's attorney, Jonathan Ray, was a seasoned litigator who had built a reputation on defending clients in seemingly impossible cases. He knew the evidence against his client was damning, but he focused on creating doubt in the minds of the jurors. He portrayed Chloe as a mentally unstable young woman who had manipulated Jonathan, exploiting his vulnerabilities and leading him down a dark path. Ray argued that Jonathan had been a victim of Chloe's obsession, that he had tried to distance himself from her, but had been unable to do so. As the trial progressed, both the prosecution and defense called witnesses to support their narratives. Emily's family and friends testified about the loving relationship she had with Jonathan before Chloe came into their lives, while the defense tried to highlight Chloe's troubled background and her supposed fixation on Jonathan. But the most anticipated moment of the trial came when Chloe took the stand. Her testimony was crucial, and both sides knew it. Chloe appeared nervous as she faced the court, her voice trembling as she recounted her version of events. She reiterated her earlier statements, claiming that Jonathan had coerced her into participating in the murder, that she had been too scared to defy him. Under cross-examination, however, Chloe's story began to unravel. Margaret Ellis skillfully poked holes in her testimony, pointing out inconsistencies and highlighting the evidence that contradicted Chloe's claims. The journal, the forensic evidence, and Chloe's own behavior after the murder all painted a different picture, one of a young woman who had been a willing participant in a heinous crime. As the trial drew to a close, the jury was left to deliberate over the fates of Jonathan and Chloe. The evidence was overwhelming, but the defense had succeeded in creating some doubt. Would the jurors believe that Jonathan was the mastermind behind the crime, or would they accept the defense's argument that Chloe had acted alone? The tension in the courtroom was palpable as the jury returned with their verdict. The entire town of Meadowbrook held its breath, waiting to hear the outcome of the case that had consumed their lives for months. The courtroom was silent as the jury foreman stood to deliver the verdict. The tension was so thick that it felt like the entire town of Meadowbrook was holding its breath, waiting to hear the fate of Jonathan and Chloe. For months, the community had been gripped by the shocking details of Emily Harris's murder, and now at last, the moment of truth had arrived. On the charge of first-degree murder, the foreman began, we find the defendant, Jonathan Harris, guilty. A collective gasp filled the courtroom, followed by whispers and murmurs as the reality of the verdict sank in. Jonathan, who had maintained a stoic demeanor throughout the trial, finally showed a flicker of emotion, his face drained of color and his hands clenched into fists. His attorney, Jonathan Ray, placed a hand on his shoulder, but the gesture did little to comfort him. The foreman continued, on the charge of conspiracy to commit murder, we find the defendant, Chloe Benson, guilty. Chloe's reaction was immediate. She broke down in tears, her sobs echoing through the courtroom. Her defense attorney tried to console her, but Chloe seemed inconsolable, her entire body shaking with the weight of the verdict. The reality of her situation had finally caught up with her. There would be no escaping the consequences of her actions. Judge Evelyn Mitchell addressed the court, her voice steady and authoritative. "Jonathan Harris, you have been found guilty of the premeditated murder of your wife, Emily Harris. The evidence presented in this court has proven beyond a reasonable doubt that you conspired with Chloe Benson to end your wife's life in a cold and calculated manner. For this crime, I hereby sentence you to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole." The judge then turned her attention to Chloe. "Chloe Benson, while the court acknowledges that you were influenced by Jonathan Harris, your role in this crime cannot be overlooked. You participated in the planning and execution of this murder, and for that, you must also face justice. I hereby sentence you to 25 years in prison with the possibility of parole after 15 years. The sentences were met with a mix of relief and sorrow from Emily's family, who had been a constant presence throughout the trial. Her brother, David Miller, held his head high, though his eyes were filled with tears. For him, justice had been served, but the loss of his sister was a wound that would never fully heal. As the court adjourned, the media swarmed outside, eager to capture the reactions of the key players in this tragic saga. Reporters jostled for position, trying to get statements from the attorneys, the families, and even the jurors who had just delivered the verdict that would forever change the lives of everyone involved. For Jonathan and Chloe, the reality of their new lives set in as they were led out of the courtroom in handcuffs. Jonathan would spend the rest of his days in the confines of a prison cell, a once respected academic whose life had unraveled in the most public and disgraceful way possible. His colleagues at Meadowbrook University, who had once admired him, now viewed him with a mix of pity and revulsion. His legacy, built over decades of work, was now tarnished beyond repair. Chloe, on the other hand, faced a different kind of future. At just 19 years old, she was sentenced to spend the next quarter century behind bars. The media portrayed her as both a victim and a villain, a young woman manipulated by a man twice her age, yet complicit in the murder of a woman who had cared for her. The complexities of her situation were lost on no one, and as she was taken away, the cameras captured the anguish on her face. As the days passed, Meadowbrook slowly began to return to normal. The media circus that had engulfed the town moved on to the next big story, leaving behind a community still reeling from the events that had transpired. But for those who had been closest to Emily, the pain of her loss lingered like a shadow over their lives. David Miller, now the unofficial spokesman for the family, vowed to keep Emily's memory alive. He organized a memorial service in her honor, inviting friends, family, and former colleagues to celebrate the life of the woman who had touched so many. The service was a solemn yet heartfelt affair, with stories and memories shared about Emily's kindness, her dedication to her work, and the joy she had brought to those around her. Yet even as the town mourned Emily, the darker elements of her story refused to fade away. The true crime documentary, Grisly Murder: A Husband's Dark Secret, was released to widespread attention, with millions tuning in to watch the retelling of the case that had shocked the nation. The documentary chronicled every detail, from the discovery of Emily's body to the unraveling of the conspiracy between Jonathan and Chloe. It portrayed the town of Meadowbrook as a once idyllic place forever scarred by the events of that fateful summer. For many, the documentary was a reminder of the depths of human cruelty and the fragility of trust. It also served as a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked desires and the devastating consequences that can arise when people allow their darker impulses to take control. In prison, Jonathan tried to maintain the same detached composure that had characterized him throughout the trial, but the reality of his life sentence weighed heavily on him. He was no longer the esteemed professor, no longer the man who had built a career on intellect and reason. Instead, he was just another inmate, his once promising life reduced to a series of monotonous days behind bars. Chloe, too, struggled to adapt to her new reality. The girl who had once been on the brink of a bright academic future now faced years of confinement. The guilt of her actions haunted her, and despite her initial attempts to downplay her role in Emily's death, she could not escape the truth. The documentary only deepened her torment. as she became a figure of public fascination, a tragic character in a real-life drama that people would talk about for years to come. Years passed, and Meadowbrook gradually healed from the wounds left by the murder of Emily Harris. The town had changed, and so had the people who lived there. But the story of Emily, Jonathan, and Chloe remained etched in the collective memory of the community, a reminder of the darkness that can hide behind even the most ordinary of facades. Emily's memory lived on through the charitable foundation established in her name, dedicated to supporting children in foster care, an endeavor she had been passionate about during her life. Her legacy of compassion and kindness served as a beacon of hope, contrasting sharply with the horrific events that had led to her death. David Miller became an advocate for victims of domestic violence, using his sister's story as a powerful example of how even the most seemingly stable relationships can harbor dangerous secrets. He spoke at conferences, gave interviews, and worked tirelessly to raise awareness about the warning signs of abuse and the importance of seeking help before it's too late. Meanwhile, the documentary continued to captivate audiences, its place cemented in the annals of true crime history. But for those who had lived through the events it depicted, the film was a painful reminder of a past they wished they could forget. Jonathan Harris remained in prison, serving his life sentence without parole. The years had not been kind to him. His health deteriorated, and his once sharp mind dulled by the monotony of prison life. He rarely spoke of the past, choosing instead to retreat into himself, a man broken by his own actions. Chloe, now in her late 30s, eventually became eligible for parole. Her time in prison had been marked by reflection and regret, and she had spent years trying to atone for her role in Emily's death. When she finally appeared before the parole board, she expressed deep remorse for her actions, acknowledging the pain she had caused and the lives she had destroyed. The parole board deliberated for hours before making their decision. Chloe was granted parole, but her release came with strict conditions. She would be under close supervision, and any violation of her parole would result in her immediate return to prison. As she walked out of the prison gates, Chloe felt a mixture of relief and fear. She was free, but the world outside had changed in ways she could barely comprehend. Her name was still associated with the infamous case, and she knew that reintegration into society would not be easy, but she was determined to try, to rebuild her life and find some measure of peace. In the years that followed, Chloe kept a low profile. She moved to a small town far from Meadowbrook, where few people knew her story. She found work, made new friends, and slowly began to build a life for herself. But the past was never far from her mind, and the memory of Emily Harris, along with the guilt of her actions, remained with her always. For the town of Meadowbrook, life continued. The events of that summer became part of the town's history, a dark chapter that people occasionally revisited, but mostly tried to forget. The children who had once known Emily as a kind nurse grew up, their memories of her fading with time. New families moved into the neighborhood, unaware of the tragedy that had once unfolded there. But for those who remembered, Emily Harris was more than just a victim of a grisly crime. She was a symbol of kindness and generosity, a reminder that even in the darkest of times, there is light to be found in the goodness of others. And so, life in Meadowbrook moved on, with the legacy of Emily Harris serving as both a warning and an inspiration, a testament to the enduring power of love, even in the face of unspeakable evil.